The defective ones are always the first to be sold. Serena had lived with this truth carved into her bones long before the Alpha King's collectors came riding into her village with iron chains and leather-bound ledgers. In the shifter territories, worth was measured in two currencies: the ferocity of your wolf and the children your body could promise. She possessed neither. No shift had ever rippled beneath her skin. No matter how many full moons she'd stood beneath, willing her bones to break and reform, no healer could coax life into a womb that the midwives whispered was closed, as if her body had decided all on its own that she wasn't worthy of carrying forward bloodlines that stretched back centuries. She was a human girl trapped in a shifter's world, beautiful enough to make it hurt worse. Golden hair that caught the light, a face that turned heads in the market, a figure that promised fertility her body would never deliver. Beauty was cruelty's favorite disguise. The morning they came for her, Serena had been standing in the wheat field at dawn, watching the mist curl around the stalks like reaching fingers. She'd known, with a terrible certainty that comes from being unwanted your entire life, that her father would sell her before the sun climbed past midday. Not might, would. The same way he'd sold their plow horse when it went lame. The same way he'd traded their old hunting dog when it could no longer track. The same way he disposed of anything that no longer served its purpose. She'd watched him through the kitchen window that morning, seen him counting and recounting the coin in their family's strongbox, his weathered fingers moving with increasing desperation. The Alpha King's war taxes had doubled this season, tripled in some provinces. Her father's face had grown more haggard with each passing week, the lines around his mouth cutting deeper. When he finally looked up and caught her watching, his eyes held no apology, only that familiar expression she'd seen 100 times before: calculation, disappointment, and finally, worst of all, cold relief. At least the defective one is good for something. Aurora had emerged from her bedroom as the sun rose higher, golden hair still tangled from sleep, her perfect shifter metabolism already burning away any trace of last night's dinner. She'd shifted 3 times yesterday just for practice, her wolf form sleek and powerful, her transformation as natural as breathing. Their father loved Aurora, the way you love a prized mare, proudly, possessively, with an eye always toward her breeding value. She would marry well. She would produce strong pups. She would carry forward the bloodline. Serena was the mistake that had come first, the daughter who served as a warning of what could go wrong when shifter blood mixed with human. Her mother had been the human, a merchant's daughter from the border towns who died bringing Serena into the world, as if the effort of producing something so fundamentally wrong had consumed her last breath. Her father had remarried within a year. Aurora's mother had been pure shifter, from a respectable pack, and Aurora had been everything Serena wasn't: perfect, powerful, possible. "Father?" Aurora's voice had carried from the doorway, still soft with sleep. "What's wrong?" He'd looked at his younger daughter with something close to tenderness. Then his gaze had slid to Serena, and his expression hardened into something resembling resolve. "Nothing that can't be fixed," he'd said. Serena had understood then. She'd always understood. She was the problem, and like all problems, she could be solved by subtraction. The King's Beta had arrived just after noon, exactly as expected. Serena had heard the hoofbeats first, 3 horses moving with military precision through the village square. She'd been in the garden, dirt under her fingernails, harvesting vegetables she'd never eat. When she'd looked up, she'd seen him, tall, broad-shouldered, with golden eyes that marked him as high-ranking pack. and a face carved from stone that suggested he'd stopped finding mercy useful years ago. Aldrich Thorne, her father had greeted him, voice strained with false cheer. We weren't expecting... The king's war taxes, the beta had interrupted, swinging down from his mount with predatory grace. His leather armor creaked, scarred from battles Serena couldn't imagine. Doubled for all territories. Payment is due today, not tomorrow. Today. Behind him, 2 guards had dismounted, their hands resting casually on sword hilts. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. Serena had watched from the garden as her father's face drained of color. I don't have... We can't possibly... Then you'll pay another way. The beta's golden eyes had swept across the property, cataloging assets with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. His gaze had lingered on Aurora, who'd shrunk back against the doorframe. My youngest is promised, her father had said quickly, desperately. Betrothed to the miller's son. The contract is signed. Then you have nothing to trade. The beta had turned back toward his horse, bored. The king will claim your land by sunset. Your family will be dispersed to the labor camps. Wait, her father's voice had cracked. I have another daughter. Serena had felt those words like a blade between her ribs. Clean, expected, still devastating. The beta had turned slowly. I saw no other daughter. In the garden. Her father had gestured, his hand trembling slightly. Whether from fear or shame, Serena couldn't tell. The older one. She's beautiful, healthy. She can work. The beta's gaze had found her then, and Serena had forced herself to stand, to brush the dirt from her dress, to lift her chin. If she was being sold, she wouldn't go cowering. Those golden eyes had traveled over her with clinical assessment. Unlike the village boys who'd looked at her with want, they could never act on. Who would mate with a female who couldn't give them pups? The beta saw only utility. She doesn't smell like shifter, he'd observed. Hybrid, her father had admitted. Her mother was human, but she's strong, obedient. She can cook, clean, work the fields. She's never been any trouble. Because you never expected anything from me, Serena had thought. Hard to disappoint when you're already considered worthless. The beta had approached her, each step deliberate. Up close, he'd smelled like leather and steel and something wild that made her human instincts scream to run. He'd caught her chin roughly, tilting her face toward the light, examining her the way you'd examine a horse's teeth. She can't shift, he'd stated, not a question. No, her father had admitted. Can't breed. Serena had felt Aurora's horrified gasp from the doorway, but she'd kept her expression blank. This was her life, laid bare in a village square. This was what she'd always been reduced to. The healers say no, her father had confirmed quietly. The beta had released her chin, considering. Then, unexpectedly, his mouth had curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. The king has many uses for beautiful slaves who can't breed, less complicated. The implication had hung in the air like smoke. Serena had felt her stomach turn, but she'd swallowed the nausea. At least they can't expect me to be a mother anymore, she'd told herself. The same lie she'd been whispering since the healers had delivered their verdict 3 years ago. Will she cover the debt? Her father had asked. The beta had pulled a leather collar from his saddlebag, iron core wrapped in worn brown leather, a ring at the front for attaching a chain. The sight of it had made Serena's knees weak, but she'd locked them, refusing to fall. She'll do, he'd said. Her father hadn't hugged her goodbye. Aurora had cried, pretty delicate tears that slid down her cheeks without making her eyes red. But she hadn't moved from their father's side, hadn't protested. hadn't offered to go instead. Serena had expected nothing less. The collar had closed around her throat with a soft click that had sounded like the closing of a book, the end of one story. She hadn't known yet what the next chapter would hold. The beta had attached a chain to the collar's ring and looped the other end around his saddle horn. "You'll walk," he'd informed her. "It's a 3-day journey to the capital. You fall, you get dragged. You run, you get hunted. You try to remove that collar, and the iron core will constrict until you stop breathing. Understand?" Serena had nodded. "Say it." "I understand," she'd forced out, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Good." He'd mounted his horse. "Let's go." As they'd left the village, Serena had looked back once. Her father had already turned away, heading back toward the house. Aurora had remained in the doorway, watching until they'd rounded the bend. No one else had come out to see her go. Why would they? The defective one was always the first to be sold, and no one mourned what they'd never valued. The 3-day journey had been worse than she'd imagined. The beta and his guards hadn't been cruel exactly. They'd fed her, allowed her water, let her sleep at night by the fire, but they'd treated her with the casual indifference reserved for livestock. She was cargo, a problem solved, a line item in a ledger. Other slaves had joined them on the road, men and women whose villages couldn't pay the king's taxes, whose families had sold them to survive another season. They'd walked in a chained line behind the horses, and at night they'd whispered their stories with the desperate need to be seen as human, just once more, before they arrived at the capital and became property. A young man named Garrett, barely 20, who'd been sold because his wolf form was weak. A woman called Miriam, 40 years old, whose husband had died in the king's wars and whose children couldn't feed her. A teenage boy named Thomas, who'd been caught stealing bread and given the choice, slavery or the noose. Serena had listened to their stories and shared none of her own. What was there to say? I'm defective, and defective things get discarded. They all knew that already. They were all defective in someone's eyes. That was why they were here. On the second night, Miriam had asked quietly, "What do you think the king's castle is like?" "Gilded cage," Garrett had muttered. "Still a cage." "I heard the king himself is a monster," Thomas had whispered, his voice cracking. "That he kills servants for sport. That his chambers are always dark because he can't stand the light." The beta had laughed from where he sat by the fire, a sound without humor. "You'll find out soon enough." And they had. The capital had risen from the plains like a dark crown, all black stone and sharp towers, walls thick enough to hold back armies, gates tall enough to make you feel insect small. The king's castle dominated the center of the city, its highest tower piercing the sky like a spear. They'd arrived at sunset, when the light turned everything blood red. The castle courtyard had been chaos, soldiers drilling, servants rushing between buildings, wagons delivering supplies. The beta had handed their chains to a hard-faced woman in servant's gray, who'd looked them over with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting rotted vegetables. "Another batch," she'd said wearily. "Line them up." They'd been arranged in the courtyard, 20 slaves from various villages, all sold to pay debts, all wearing iron collars. Serena had stood between Garrett and Miriam, trying not to shake. "Head up," the woman had barked at her. "The steward will select your assignments. Kitchen workers, field hands, chamber servants, stable muckers. You'll go where you're needed. You'll work until you drop. You'll be grateful for it. The king's household doesn't tolerate laziness or disobedience. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," they'd chorused. The steward had been a thin man, with a face like a hatchet, sharp, and cutting. He'd walk down the line slowly, pointing and deciding fates with the casual authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Kitchens, fields, stables, kitchens, laundry. When he'd reached Serena, he'd paused, frowned. Too pretty for the kitchens. She'll cause problems. Laundry, then, the woman had suggested. The steward had circled her, considering. No, the upper chambers could use. No one is assigning anyone to anywhere. The voice had cut through the courtyard like a blade, and every servant had immediately dropped into a bow. Serena, not knowing what else to do, had followed suit, staring at the cobblestones. But she'd seen the boots first. Black leather, buckled to the knee, scarred from combat. Then the armor as her gaze traveled up. Not ceremonial pretty armor, but the real thing, marked with the evidence of battles survived. A cloak of raven feathers that moved like living shadow, leather bracers on forearms corded with muscle, a sword at the hip that looked like it had tasted blood recently. And then his face. Alpha King Darius had been nothing like the monster Thomas had whispered about. He'd been worse. He'd been real. Dark hair, long enough to brush his shoulders, half tied back from a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as his castle. A strong jaw darkened with stubble, a mouth set in a grim line that suggested smiling was something he'd forgotten how to do. A scar cutting through one eyebrow, another across his cheekbone. Marks of violence survived. But it was his eyes that had stolen Serena's breath. Storm gray, the color of thunderheads before lightning strikes. Eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Eyes that looked at the world and found it wanting. Those eyes had swept across the line of slaves, bored and dismissive, until they'd landed on Serena, and stopped. The air had changed, thickened. Every servant in the courtyard had gone utterly still, as if they'd sensed something Serena couldn't understand, something in the way the king's gaze had sharpened, focused, fixed on her with sudden, unsettling intensity. He'd moved forward, his boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate weight. The other slaves had shrunk back slightly, instinctively, but Serena had found herself unable to move, rooted, trapped in the gravity of his attention. He'd stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell him. Leather and steel and something wilder, something that made her human blood recognize she was in the presence of an apex predator. "Look at me," he'd commanded, his voice low and rough, like he didn't use it often for anything but orders. Serena had lifted her gaze, and the impact of meeting those storm-gray eyes directly had been like touching lightning. Power, danger, and something else, something that flickered in their depths and vanished too quickly to name. "This one," King Darius had said, his gaze never leaving hers. "She serves in my private wing." The courtyard had erupted in whispers. The steward had paled. Even the beta had looked surprised. "Your Majesty," the steward had begun carefully, "that position is typically reserved for—" "Did I ask for your opinion?" The king's voice hadn't risen, but it had cut through the courtyard like winter wind. "No, Your Majesty." "Then have her brought to my chambers. Now." He'd turned then, his raven feather cloak swirling, and walked away without another word, without looking back, without caring that he'd just upended every expectation Serena had carried with her in chains. As the whispers grew louder and servants rushed to obey, Serena had felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, she'd learned better than to hope, but something close to it, something dangerous. The iron collar had still been locked around her throat, but as servants had hurried her toward the castle's inner sanctum, toward the king's private wing, where no common slave was ever sent, She'd realized something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The iron had grown warm against Serena's throat by the second day, heated by her own body until the metal felt like it was melting into her skin. She'd stopped trying to slip her fingers beneath it. The beta had been right. Any pressure against the collar's mechanism made it constrict, a reminder that even her breathing existed at someone else's mercy now. The other slaves walked in silence mostly, conserving energy for a journey that seemed designed to break them before they ever reached the castle. But at night, huddled by the fire with their chains pulled between them like sleeping snakes, they whispered the stories that fear breeds in darkness. "I heard he killed his own father to take the throne," Garrett murmured, his young face gaunt in the firelight. "Tore out his throat with his bare hands during the challenge." "That's just pack law," Miriam countered, though her voice trembled. "The strong replace the weak. But I heard worse. I heard he cursed. That something happened during his coronation, something dark, and now he's more monster than man." Thomas leaned closer, his teenage bravado cracking. "My cousin worked in the castle kitchens. She said servants disappear from his wing, go in to serve dinner, never come out. They find the rooms destroyed come morning, furniture shattered, walls clawed, but no bodies, just blood." "Stop it," Serena said quietly. Not because she didn't believe them. She'd learned that monsters rarely looked like monsters until they showed you their teeth, but because fear wouldn't change what waited for them. Fear was just another cage, and she'd worn enough of those. Garrett turned to her, desperate for any contradiction. "You don't think it's true?" "I think we'll find out soon enough." She pulled her thin blanket tighter. "And whether he's a monster or just a man who enjoys the reputation, will still be his property come sunrise. So sleep. You'll need your strength." But she didn't sleep. None of them did. They lay awake beneath stars that seemed too beautiful for a world this cruel, and they counted the hours until they'd learn which whispered story was true. The castle appeared on the third day, like a dark prophecy made solid, all black stone and sharp towers that seemed designed to cut hope from the sky. The walls rose thick enough to hold back armies, tall enough to remind everyone who approached exactly how small they were, how insignificant, how easily crushed. As they passed through gates that groaned like dying things, Serena felt the weight of stone and shadow press down on her chest. This wasn't a castle, it was a mouth, and they were walking willingly down its throat. The courtyard swallowed them into chaos. Soldiers drilled in perfect formation, their movements sharp as blade work. Servants rushed between buildings carrying linens, firewood, buckets of water drawn from wells that probably ran deep enough to drown secrets. Wagon wheels creaked under the weight of supplies that spoke of a household too large to comprehend, a machine that consumed people and resources with equal efficiency. The beta dismounted and handed their chains to a woman whose face had been carved by years into something hard and unforgiving. She looked them over with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting spoiled meat. "Another batch," she said flatly. "Line them up against the wall." They were arranged like merchandise, which Serena supposed they were. 20 slaves from different villages, all wearing iron collars, all sold to balance ledgers that cared nothing for the weight of a human heart. She stood between Garrett and Miriam, both of them shaking despite the warm afternoon sun. "Heads up," the woman barked, pacing before them like a general inspecting troops. "The steward will assign your positions. You'll work where you're told. You'll sleep where you're told. You'll speak when spoken to, and not before." The king's household doesn't tolerate laziness, disobedience, or stupidity. Break these rules, and you'll wish you'd been sent to the mines instead. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am. They chorused, voices hollow with resignation. The steward arrived moments later, a thin man with a hatchet face and eyes that calculated value with brutal precision. He walked the line slowly, pointing and pronouncing sentences as casually as sorting grain. Kitchens, fields, stables, laundry, kitchens again. When he reached Serena, he stopped, frowned, circled her once, his gaze clinical and cold. Too pretty for the kitchens. She'll distract the staff, cause problems among the men. The laundry, then, the harsh-faced woman suggested. Perhaps. Though the upper chambers could use, no one is being assigned anywhere. The voice cut through the courtyard like a blade through silk, and the effect was immediate. Every servant dropped into a bow so deep their foreheads nearly touched their knees. The soldiers stopped mid-drill. Even the horses seemed to still. Serena, not knowing what else to do, followed suit, her gaze fixed on cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of weight. But she saw the boots first, black leather buckled to the knee, scarred from combat that had tested them, and found them adequate. Then armor, as her gaze traveled up despite herself. Not the ornamental kind nobles wore to feasts, but real armor marked with the evidence of battles survived. A cloak of raven feathers that moved like something alive, like shadow given weight. And then Alpha King Darius himself stood before them, and every whispered story suddenly seemed insufficient. He wasn't the monster Thomas had described. He was something worse. He was real. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, half tied back from a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as his castle. A jaw darkened with stubble, a mouth set in a grim line that suggested smiling was a language he'd forgotten. Scars cut through one eyebrow, across his cheekbone. A map of violence survived and lessons learned in blood. But his eyes, storm gray, the color of thunderheads before lightning strikes. Eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Eyes that looked at the world and found it perpetually wanting. Those eyes swept across the line of slaves with bored dismissal until they landed on Serena and stopped. The air changed, thickened. Every servant in the courtyard went utterly still, and Serena felt it even though she didn't understand it. Something in the quality of the king's attention, something that made her prey instinct scream even as her human curiosity demanded she look up, meet that gaze, understand what had changed. He moved forward, his boots striking cobblestones with deliberate weight. The other slaves shrank back instinctively, but Serena found herself unable to move, rooted by something she couldn't name. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell leather and steel and something wilder underneath, something that made her human blood recognize she was in the presence of an apex predator who was choosing moment by moment not to kill her. Look at me. The command was low, rough, like he didn't use his voice often for anything but orders that would be obeyed or punished. Serena lifted her gaze, and the impact of meeting those storm-gray eyes directly stole the breath from her lungs. Power, danger, and something else flickering in those depths, something that vanished too quickly to name, but left her feeling like she'd glimpsed something not meant for common eyes. "This one," King Darius said, his gaze never leaving hers, his voice carrying across the courtyard with absolute authority. "She serves in my private wing." The whispers erupted immediately. The steward paled. Even the beta looked surprised, though he masked it quickly. "Your Majesty," the steward began, his voice careful as a man approaching a sleeping wolf. "That position is typically reserved for—" "Did I ask for your opinion?" The king's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut through the courtyard like winter wind through autumn leaves. "No, your majesty." "Then have her brought to the tower, my chambers, now." He turned then, his raven feather cloak swirling like wings preparing for flight, and walked away without another word, without looking back, without caring that he'd just shattered every expectation Serena had carried in chains for 3 days. As servants rushed forward, their hands on her arms urgent and afraid, as the whispers grew into a cacophony of speculation and fear, Serena felt the iron collar press against her throat and realized something that terrified her. Her father had sold her, expecting she'd disappear into kitchens or fields, forgotten and eventually dead. But Alpha King Darius had looked at her, really looked, with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in her life, and chosen her for something else entirely. She didn't know yet if that made her lucky or damned. She suspected she'd find out soon enough. The tower room was a cage gilded with silk and firelight. Tapestries softened stone walls that had probably witnessed centuries of secrets, and the bed looked more comfortable than anything Serena had ever touched. But luxury didn't change what she was. Property, positioned somewhere between servant and prisoner, chosen for reasons she didn't understand and suspected she wouldn't like. Marta arrived within the hour, an older woman whose face carried the particular weariness of someone who'd survived by knowing which questions never to ask. She moved through the room, lighting candles with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp despite her age. "You'll maintain the king's private chambers," she said without preamble. "Fresh linens daily, meals brought at dawn and dusk. Leave them outside the door, knock twice, retreat immediately. You do not enter unless summoned. Understood?" Marta turned then, her eyes suddenly urgent in a way that made Serena's spine straighten. "3 rules. Break them, and you'll die, girl, and I won't be able to help you." She held up one weathered finger. "Never enter during the full moon." Another finger. "Never speak of what you see to anyone." The 3rd finger rose like a final warning. "And never, under any circumstances, show fear. He can smell it, and it makes things worse." "Makes what worse?" But Marta was already leaving, the door closing behind her like a coffin lid. That night, Serena learned what the servants whispered about. The sound started after midnight, a roar that rattled the windows too deep for any human throat. Furniture shattered against stone, glass exploded, and beneath it all, a sound that made her chest tighten with something worse than fear. Agony, raw and animal, and somehow profoundly human, the torture of something caught between 2 impossible states. She should have stayed in bed, should have pulled the blankets over her head and pretended she heard nothing. Instead, she found herself at the connecting door, her hand trembling as she pressed her eye to the gap. The king knelt in the center of devastation, his body convulsing. Bones cracked and reformed beneath skin that rippled like water, his face contorted, jaw extending, teeth lengthening into fangs that caught the firelight. Dark fur sprouted and receded in waves of transformation that looked like dying and being reborn simultaneously. His hands clawed at the floor, nails becoming talons that left gouges in ancient stone. And his eyes, those storm-gray eyes she'd met in the courtyard, were wild with an anguish that transcended physical pain. This was a soul being torn apart. Serena stumbled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. By morning she understood her true purpose. They brought her to the destroyed chamber with buckets and rags, and she cleaned blood from walls, collected shattered furniture, swept up the evidence of a king who became something else when darkness fell. The stories had been true after all. She just hadn't understood they were incomplete. Invisible wounds. The days settled into a rhythm measured by silence and service. Serena learned to move through the king's chambers like smoke, present but unobtrusive, essential but invisible. She brought meals that went half-eaten, changed linens on a bed that looked barely slept in, and existed in the periphery of a man who commanded kingdoms but couldn't seem to rest in his own skin. King Darius in daylight was exactly what the whispers had promised. Cold, strategic. He sat in council meetings she could hear through the walls, his voice cutting through advisors' platitudes with decisions that were brutal in their efficiency. When he acknowledged her at all, it was with a glance that passed through her like she was made of glass, a nod that dismissed her before she'd fully entered the room. But after each full moon, she noticed what others couldn't see. The claw marks on his forearms, self-inflicted during transformation, some already angry with infection. The gash across his ribs that should have been stitched but was left to heal crooked. Deep scratches on his shoulders where he'd tried to tear the beast from his own flesh. Pride kept him from the healers, or perhaps secrecy. Admitting the wounds would mean acknowledging what caused them. Serena watched him move through the chamber one morning, his jaw tight against pain he'd never voice, and made a decision that might cost her everything. She left a tray by his reading chair before dawn, clean bandages, salve, made from herbs she'd traded her breakfast rations for, a small basin of warm water. Then she disappeared into the adjacent room and held her breath, waiting for rage or punishment. When she returned an hour later, the tray was gone. The next month, after another night of tortured transformation, she did it again. This time she added stronger salve, needle and thread for the deeper wounds. She found them used, carefully arranged on the empty tray, and beneath them, a single word written in handwriting that looked like it had been practiced with a trembling hand. Why? Serena stared at that word for a long moment, understanding it wasn't really a question. It was a test, an opening, the first real acknowledgement that she existed as something more than furniture in his carefully controlled world. She picked up the charcoal, her own hand steadier than his had been, and wrote her answer beneath his question. Because no one else will. The first truth. She left her response in the margin of a military treatise he'd been reading, her handwriting small and careful. Because pain shouldn't be endured alone, even if you've convinced yourself you deserve it. The next morning, she found a question scrawled in the blank space of a historical text. What makes you think I've convinced myself of anything? And so it began. A strange correspondence conducted in stolen moments and careful words, notes tucked between pages, observations left on parchment scraps, questions that circled around the thing neither of them could name directly. They wrote in the language of people who'd learned that truth was safer delivered in pieces, that vulnerability required careful architecture. She learned he'd been 20 when the curse took hold, standing on the eve of his coronation in armor that still felt new. A rival pack's shaman had pronounced it in front of assembled alphas, punishment for showing mercy to enemy prisoners, for choosing diplomacy over slaughter, for being something his brutal father would never have been. The curse was designed to be poetic, Howin, he wrote, his letters tight with old anger. Make the merciful king into a monster, prove that kindness is weakness, force him to become the savage his compassion proved he wasn't. I've been fighting it for 5 years. Every month, it takes more. Every transformation leaves less of me behind. Serena stared at those words for a long time before responding. They called me defective, she wrote finally, her hand steadier than her heart. My whole life. Broken because my body wouldn't perform the function everyone agreed gave women value. My father sold me because he'd already decided I was worthless. I believed the stories they told about me for so long that I forgot I could write my own. But here's what I learned. Stories don't need to reproduce to matter. Neither do people. She left the note where he'd find it, then retreated to her room and pressed her forehead against cool stone, wondering if honesty was bravery or just another form of foolishness. The next morning, she found a single sentence waiting. Thank you for reminding me that survival can look like many things. The council's pressure. The council's voices carried through stone walls like the rumble of distant thunder, impossible to ignore. Serena tried to focus on folding linens, on the simple meditation of corners meeting corners, but the words found her anyway. 5 years unwed, Your Majesty. The packs are restless. They need assurance of succession, of stability. Princess Isadora would bring the northern territories into firm alliance. Another voice, smoother, practiced in persuasion. She's beautiful, well-trained in statecraft, and her bloodline is impeccable. The match is more than advantageous. It's necessary. Silence. Then Darius's voice flat and final. I'll consider it. Serena's hand stilled on the linen. The pain that lanced through her chest had no right to exist. She was a slave. He was a king. And whatever strange understanding had grown between them in margins and midnight confessions changed nothing about the fundamental architecture of their worlds. She was exactly what everyone had always said. Not enough. Not for her father, not for her village, and certainly not for this. She forced herself to finish folding, to retreat to her room, to remember her place. But that night, after the transformation, she found herself in his chamber as she had for weeks now, with his silent permission, with bandages and salve and steady hands. He lay among the ruins of furniture he'd destroyed, his body caught between forms, breathing ragged with exhaustion. She cleaned the worst of the wounds carefully, professionally, pretending her heart wasn't a stone in her chest. His hand caught her wrist, not rough, but desperate. When she looked up, his eyes were still wolf-wild but achingly human, and his voice emerged broken between fangs that were slowly receding. She'll never see this. The words came thick, tortured. No one sees this. But you. Serena's throat tightened. She understood then, with a clarity that hurt worse than any revelation should. He was as trapped by his crown as she'd been by her infertility. He could marry a princess, could secure alliances and produce heirs if the curse allowed, could play the role of king that politics demanded. But this, the transformation, the agony, the truth of what he became in darkness, this he would bear alone, always alone, except for her. I know, she whispered, and continued tending his wounds with hands that trembled only slightly. The stolen dance. The castle had transformed into something foreign, filled with perfumed nobility and political smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Serena moved through it like a shadow among shadows, carrying linens and trays, existing in the spaces between important people, having important conversations about alliances she'd never be part of. Sleep wouldn't come that night. She found herself wandering corridors lit by guttering torches until her feet carried her to the grand ballroom, where tomorrow's celebration would occur. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, painting the empty floor silver. Musicians' stands waited like skeletal sentries. Garlands of flowers hung from columns, their perfume cloying in the stillness. She'd never been taught to dance. Her village had deemed it wasteful. Why teach someone who'd never attend a mating ceremony, who'd never be chosen, who'd never matter enough to warrant the effort? She didn't hear him enter, didn't sense his presence, until his voice emerged from the darkness near the doorway, rough with exhaustion. Couldn't sleep either. Serena turned, her heart stumbling. King Darius stood in shirt sleeves, his formal armor abandoned, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. Tired, uncertain, dreading the performance tomorrow would demand, the smiling king, the willing groom, the man who wasn't slowly losing himself to a curse with every passing moon. He crossed the ballroom floor, his boots echoing in the emptiness, stopped before her, and without speaking, without explanation, offered his hand. She stared at it for a heartbeat, 2, then placed her palm against his. They danced in silence, in darkness, with no witnesses but the moon. He guided her through steps she didn't know, and somehow her body understood the language his was speaking. There was no music except their breathing, no audience except shadows, no pretense except the truth they'd been writing in margins for weeks. For the first time in her life, Serena felt completely seen, not for what she lacked, but for who she was, a woman who tended wounds no one else would acknowledge, who saw monsters and chose compassion, who'd been called broken so many times she'd learned to build herself into something different than what others expected. For the first time in years, Darius didn't feel like a king or a monster, just a man dancing with someone who knew his worst truth and hadn't fled. The clock chimed midnight, shattering the spell. He stopped, his hand still holding hers, his eyes storm gray and infinitely sad. "I can't give you what they expect," he said, quietly. Serena didn't know if he meant the council or her. Wasn't sure it mattered. "I never expected anything," she whispered back. The lie tasted like ash on her tongue. The ensealing curse, Marta, found Serena preparing bandages the evening before the full moon, her weathered hands catching Serena's wrists with surprising strength. "You can't be here tonight." Fear made the old woman's voice sharp. "He's been worse lately, more violent. The beast is winning, girl. And if you're in that room when he loses, I'm not leaving him alone. He'll die, maybe." Serena met her eyes steadily. "But he's been dying alone for 5 years. That ends tonight." When the transformation began, she understood why everyone fled. The sounds were worse up close, bones cracking like green wood in fire, cartilage tearing, the wet restructuring of a body being rebuilt into something it was never meant to be. Darius collapsed to his knees, his spine arching at an impossible angle, and the scream that tore from his throat was so human it made her chest ache. His clothes shredded as his body expanded. Fur rippled across skin in waves of black and silver. His face elongated, jaw cracking and reforming, teeth becoming fangs that caught the moonlight like knives. Claws erupted from fingertips, scoring the stone floor, and his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, went wild with agony and rage and the loss of everything that made him human. Serena stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, remembering Marta's rule: never show fear. The beast that had been Darius rose on legs that were neither man nor wolf, but something caught between. It turned toward her, and she saw the moment awareness flickered. Human consciousness fighting against animal instinct, recognition struggling through the curse's fog. His muzzle opened, revealing fangs designed for tearing. A growl emerged, deep and threatening. Then, impossibly, Serena. Her name, broken and distorted but unmistakable. His name for her, spoken by something that should have forgotten language entirely. She moved closer, slowly, her hands open and empty. I'm here. I'm not leaving. The beast's head tilted, confusion warring with rage. Every month for 5 years he'd transformed alone, lost himself completely to the curse's hunger. But her presence, her refusal to abandon him, was changing something fundamental. The curse fed on isolation, on self-loathing, on the belief that monsters deserved to suffer alone, and she was starving it. In the shadows beyond the window, eyes watched through dark magic. Princess Isadora's father had crafted this curse carefully, had planted it like a seed meant to grow into chaos. The northern territories would fall to him when Darius finally lost himself completely. But this human slave, this defective nothing, was unraveling 5 years of careful work. She would have to be eliminated. Soon. The assassination attempt. The celebration glittered with false joy and political smiles. Serena moved through it carrying wine, invisible again in servant's gray, watching Princess Isadora laugh at something an ambassador said, while her father stood nearby like a spider, satisfied with its web. She'd returned to her role, as if the transformation night hadn't happened, as if she hadn't watched a king fight his own nature and speak her name with a monster's tongue. Duty was easier than examining what any of it meant. The cup was already filled when she reached King Darius. She lifted it from the tray with practiced efficiency. Her gaze lowered and felt the weight of it, slightly wrong, the liquid inside catching light strangely. She looked up, meeting his eyes for a fraction of a heartbeat, and saw he'd noticed too. Shifter senses, sharper than human, detecting something amiss. The shout came before she could act. The slave! She's poisoned the king! Guards materialized from the crowd. Steel hands seized her arms, the wine cup clattering to the floor. The celebration fractured into chaos, nobles gasping, advisors shouting, Princess Isadora's hand flying to her throat in perfectly performed shock. "Search her," someone demanded. They found a vial in her pocket, one she'd never seen before, marked with symbols she couldn't read. Darius stood frozen, his face carved from stone. The council surrounded him immediately, their voices urgent with the politics of the moment. Execute her now. Show strength. Show that mercy was the mistake everyone always said it was. She watched him make the calculation. Appearing strong meant her immediate death. Showing mercy again meant appearing weak, confirming every whisper that his compassion would destroy him. "Take her to the dungeons," he said flatly. "She'll stand trial at dawn." The cells beneath the castle smelled of old fear and older stone. Serena sat on the narrow bench, her iron collar cold against her throat, and counted the hours until a trial that would end only one way. The footsteps came after midnight, measured, deliberate, belonging to someone who didn't fear the darkness down here. King Darius appeared at her cell door, still in his formal attire, looking like he'd aged years in hours. He gripped the bars with both hands, his knuckles white with tension. "Why did you stay during the transformation?" The question emerged rough, desperate. "I could have killed you, should have killed you. Why didn't you run?" Serena met his gaze through the bars. "Because you needed someone to see that you were still fighting, still human, still worthy of something besides fear. I'm cursed. I'm becoming—" "You're a man who showed mercy and was punished for it," she interrupted. "A king who chooses diplomacy over slaughter, someone who's fought himself for 5 years rather than surrender. Your curse doesn't define you. Your mercy isn't weakness." She moved closer, her voice dropping. "You're enough exactly as you are." His breath caught. She watched the words land like blows, watched them crack something in him that armor couldn't protect. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 23 years believing she wasn't enough, and now she was convincing a king he was. "They'll execute you at dawn," he said finally. "I know." "I can't." His voice broke. "The council, the politics. If I show mercy again—" "I know," she repeated softly. "I understand." But they both knew that understanding didn't change what morning would bring. The breaking of chains. The full moon rose over the dungeons like a pale judge, and Serena understood the timing wasn't coincidence. Isadora's father had orchestrated everything. The poison, the framing, her imprisonment in cells no one monitored during transformations. She'd be found dead come morning, torn apart by a beast with no memory, and the king would finally break completely. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps too careful, blades being drawn with practiced silence. Assassins, sent to finish what the curse was meant to start. Then other footsteps running desperate. Darius burst into the corridor, already half transformed, his shirt shredded across shoulders that were broadening impossibly. His face contorted in the agony she knew too well, bones cracking and reforming, but his eyes, storm gray and utterly aware, found hers through the bars. "Get back," he managed, his voice already roughening. The assassins attacked. Steel flashed in torchlight. Darius moved with inhuman speed, his transformation completing even as he fought, body elongating into the beast that should have consumed his mind entirely. But it didn't. He caught the first blade with clawed hands, snapped it, drove the assassin back with a roar that shook dust from ancient stones, spun toward the second with killing precision. The third tried to reach Serena's cell, and the beast that was Darius intercepted with a snarl that was somehow still protective, still deliberate, still him. He fought with a beast's strength but a man's purpose, and Serena watched the impossible happen. The curse shattered like glass against stone. When the last assassin fell, Darius stood among the carnage, still transformed, still monstrous, but his eyes clear with human consciousness. He turned to her cell, his clawed hand reaching for the lock, and she understood. It had never been punishment. It had been a test. A curse designed to break him or prove that his strength came from his humanity, not despite it. That mercy wasn't weakness, that the capacity to love despite darkness was the greatest power any king could wield. The lock broke. The door swung open, and slowly, painfully, his body reformed itself into the man she knew. The council chamber filled with assembled nobility, their faces a gallery of judgment. Isadora's father stood in chains, his plot exposed, his daughter pale with shock or complicity. Serena couldn't tell which. "War is inevitable," an advisor declared. "The Northern Pack cannot be allowed. There will be no war." Darius's voice cut through the chamber with absolute authority. He stood before his throne, Serena beside him wearing servant's gray but standing like something more. "Because Serena of no house will address you." The murmurs erupted immediately. A slave, speaking to nobility. The very suggestion was obscene, but Serena stepped forward, her iron collar catching the light, and spoke the truth she'd spent a lifetime learning. "You measure worth by bloodlines in biology, by who can produce heirs, secure alliances, strengthen your precious lines." Her voice carried across the chamber without wavering. "I am everything you consider defective. My body won't bear children. No pack would claim me. By your metrics, I'm worthless." She let that sit for a moment, watching their faces confirm exactly what she'd said. But I stood before a cursed king when everyone else fled. I saw a monster and chose compassion. I tended wounds no one else would acknowledge. And in doing so, I helped break a curse 5 years old because I understood something you've all forgotten. Worth isn't measured by what we can produce or how we serve political convenience. It's measured by the courage to be vulnerable, to show mercy, to see others truly. She turned to Darius, then back to the assembly. My defect makes me politically neutral. I'll never produce an heir to challenge your bloodlines. I threaten nothing you value. The irony burned like acid. Which makes me perfect for exactly what you need, proof that strength comes from humanity, not despite it. The Northern Pack's ambassador stood, his face flushed with shame or rage. But he had no counter. She'd outmaneuvered them with the very thing they'd used to dismiss her. Within the hour, they withdrew. The council chamber had grown accustomed to her presence, though some advisors still flinched when she spoke. Serena stood beside the throne, not on it, never on it, wearing deep blue rather than servant's gray, her iron collar replaced by nothing at all. The King's Council, they called her now, the first human given voice in shifter politics. Unprecedented, the elder council member had protested months ago, his jowls quivering with indignation. Darius had looked at him with those storm-gray eyes that had learned to carry both strength and softness. So was a king who ruled with mercy and survived. Precedent begins somewhere. Now she reviewed trade agreements, advised on diplomatic tensions, spoke truth to power because she'd never learned to be afraid of it. The advisors who'd wanted her executed had learned to listen, or at least to tolerate the fact that their king valued her counsel above their centuries of tradition. But it was in their private chambers, away from crowns and expectations, that they became simply themselves. Darius found her at the window one evening, watching the full moon rise without fear. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, both of them whole in ways that had nothing to do with curses or fertility or the metrics others use to measure worth. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Refusing the title? You could have been queen." "I was already told my whole life what I should be," she said, leaning back into his warmth. "I'd rather choose what I am." He pressed a kiss to her temple, understanding in the gesture what words couldn't quite hold. They'd both learned the same lesson through different agonies, that being broken open was sometimes the only way to let the light in, that the most profound love came not from finding someone who completed you, but someone who saw you were already whole, scars, defects, curses, and all. Outside, the moon rose full and bright, and neither of them feared what it would bring. They'd already survived the darkness. Together, they'd learned to thrive in the light